Hi guitarlings, I'm Gray at Hub Guitar. Today we're going to study the tune Drifting Clouds by Masaaki Kishibe, who was generous enough to give me the chance to do this tune, basically give me the permission to put this out here on YouTube. So I hope you'll show him your appreciation, support, follow him on YouTube, and check out more of his music. What I love about Drifting Clouds is that even a total beginner guitar player has a chance that if they learn these chords that are in, there's just two chords really going back and forth, that they can play a beautiful solo fingerstyle tune. So it really is brilliant in that way. I find that almost everybody with a little bit of effort can learn their first solo guitar tune this way. Drifting Clouds is in a kind of unusual tuning, sometimes called a low C tuning. And without the capo, we're talking about C, G, D, G, A, D. So the way I get to there is I tune the A string, I tune the B string down to A by playing it and matching that to the 5th string, which is also tuned to A. Then I also detune the high E string down to D using the same method, only now I'm comparing it to the 4th string. Once I've done that, I can actually take the 5th string and match that to G. I didn't do that first because I needed that reference A, so I do that last. I tune this 5th string down to G. And then to get this down to C, you can use a tuner, or if you can hear this as Do, So, you can kind of hear your way down a 5th and tune it that way as well by the interval. Probably a great idea just to use a guitar tuner while you're getting used to this, but you do need a chromatic tuner. You can't use a tuner that is specifically for the E, A, D, G, B, E tuning. If you use a standard tuning tuner, it will be very confusing and difficult trying to get it into the tuning. Now, as originally played, there was a capo on the 9th fret, which gives us a very airy and a dreamy sound, which is pretty appropriate given the title, Drifting Clouds. However, I like to do it down at the 3rd fret. Now, after I've put a capo on, I'm pretty finicky, and I like to actually recheck my tuning with the guitar tuner, but I'm actually not really looking at the names of the notes anymore because that would be very confusing. Instead, I'm just trying to make sure that it's kind of in the green. I noticed that after putting a capo on, a lot of times my tuning is slightly off on 1 or 2 strings. So here we go. Starting up at the pickup measure, we've got an open 3rd string and an open 2nd string. Then we're going to take our index finger and put it on the 2nd fret of the 4th string, and pluck around that until we get to our first chord on beat 3 of measure 1. So there's a few different ways to play this chord. You could actually put your index finger on the 2nd fret of the big string, and then you could put your middle finger on the 2nd fret of the 5th string, and then either your 3rd finger, which is a bit of a stretch, or your pinky finger onto the 4th fret of the 4th string. But you do want to be able to hold those all down at once. You don't want to try to fret the first 2 and then switch to the next one, because you're just going to make the sound kind of choppy. So you want to try to get them all at once. The way I like to do it is I like to do a little partial bar with my index finger across strings 5 and 6. And then I put my pinky up on the 4th fret of the 4th string. The only trick with that is you've really got to make sure that if you do that, your index finger clears off of the fretboard before it touches the 3rd string, and that's going to let you play that open 3rd string later on in that measure. So we've got this. I love it already. I'm totally sold on this tune. Now we're going to the 2nd measure where we've got a 4-4-4. And if you followed my suggestion to do the little bar, then it's quite natural to slide that index finger up and do another half bar there. So altogether we would have this. Now that might feel like a little bit of finger yoga to you, and you may not like it, and that's fine. If you decide to explore some alternate fingerings, that's great. Just make sure you're thinking about, why am I choosing this fingering? Is this the smartest way for me to do it? So this is the alternate I suggested if you don't like the bar. Fingers 1, 2, and 4. And then when you slide up, you could just use 3 different fingers, like fingers 2, 3, and 4. If you do that though, just be sure to really squeeze them tight together, because that's how you're going to fit them all on the same fret. Whatever you choose for your fingering, I think that you want to stop and do some chord push-ups. Just go back and forth between those 2 chords before you try to actually read the plucking pattern. Do that a bunch of times until you feel comfortable, and I can pretty much assure you that if you master the motion of going from this chord to this chord, then you've got this entire tune in the bag, because that's really almost all there is to it. So now we're on measure 3, just a repeat of the same idea. Go to measure 4. Whenever you see an open string to a fretted note, you might choose to interpret that as a hammer-on or a pull-off. I typically will, just so I can save my plucking hand a little bit of juice. As we go to the 5th measure, we've got a repeat of the same idea. And then at the 8th measure, we go to the tonic chord, the 1 chord, which is just all open strings. So once you've got an idea of how that chord motion is going to look, I highly recommend you just pluck through this thing without the left hand. It'll sound fun. And as you look at the notation, you can focus on letting your fretting hand find the right notes, the right strings. You can think carefully about, what finger should be plucking which string in what case. Of course, it won't sound like much, but it's a great way of focusing on just your fretting hand. And now, just like that, we're in the B section. It opens up like that. Pretty simple. Make sure as you play these passages, though, that you don't disturb or interrupt the vibration, the ringing of the string. So as I play this, and I go to my next note on the 4th string, and I play that open string, I don't want to accidentally touch another string and kill its vibration. Otherwise, I'm going to get this choppy sound. That's really not what we're going for. We want something where those notes really blend together with a nice, smooth sound. And that's actually the real tricky part, even for an advanced guitar player, at least for myself. That's something that I still often think about is, how can I really make sure that I don't interrupt a string while it's vibrating? It's like, I try to envision that the strings are made out of lava and that I'm not allowed to touch them except when there are notes. Going to measure 10 and 11, just another repeat. In measure 12, we've got this same chord, but just a little bit of a picking pattern. So make sure that you observe that carefully, because you wouldn't want the wrong note to end up in the melody. So make sure that you're playing the right strings. To measure 13, nothing really interesting there, but measure 13 does feel a little bit different than the other measures. So whenever you find that a measure is different, maybe give some more attention to it, because that's where you're likely to screw up. When you've been dealing with the same repeated content over and over again, you'll just start to naturally get very good at it. But if one out of the 30 or so measures is a little bit weird, you'll tend to mess up there. So just be mindful of that. In measure 14, the bass goes to the 5th string, and we go back to this nice chord. Notice that I use my middle finger for the first note, and I switch to my index finger, go to open string, and then I use an entire finger to get the next chord. Of course, you could also use an alternate fingering for that chord. That's fine. But the key is that you at least think of it as a chord with a particular chord fingering. Measure 15 is a good opportunity to mess up if there ever were one. So as we were saying, you get kind of familiar with a piece, and internally a lot of its content is repeated. So when there's something unique or unusual, it's very easy to under-practice that spot and mess it up. I think measure 15 is a perfect example. Even when I learned this for the lesson, I had to stop and do measure 15 an extra 50 times just to make sure that I was not going to mess it up when the time came. Also note that it really helps to plan ahead your fingering. So for measure 15, I'm going to start with my index finger on the 2nd fret of the 5th string. I'm going to put my middle finger on the 2nd fret of the 4th string. And then I'm going to put my pinky finger on the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. And then I've got this hammer-on pull-off thing. And I want to do that with my 3rd finger, which I've actually reserved for that purpose. So 1 and 2 are still here, but then 4 lifts up. And that lets 3 come in and do the hammer-on pull-up. If I didn't have a plan for that, I might get through it, but it wouldn't sound as smooth. And I wrote that as a triplet, but really, I think that's a spot where it doesn't help to be too technical as to what the actual rhythm is. It's just got to fit into that eighth note. You could do that in a lot of different ways, and I just do it as a triplet. And go back to this chord that we opened with. And then measure 16th is another sort of point of rest or cadence before we go on to section C. All right, so if you've been enjoying this tune so far, wait until you see section C. Suddenly at section C, we've got much more drive in the bottom layer and a feeling of activity overall. So for section C, I mostly like to follow one of the traditional methods of plucking patterns, which is to give the thumb 6, 5, and 4, those three strings, and then let the index finger take the third string, middle finger takes the second string, and then ring finger takes the first string. I find if I do that, it actually is pretty suitable to this downward. It's pretty easy, isn't it, to just kind of push your thumb down and catch consecutive strings, so I think it really fits nicely in this case. So I'm doing thumb, 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 index, thumb, 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 index, thumb. If you're not quite sure of the phrasing or the rhythm, just remember that this is complete, pure eighth notes. So you could even set a metronome or tap your foot and just give every note that you see on the page the exact same timing, and you will be right. Just like that. Measure 19 is pretty similar. I think it's pretty helpful here at measure 19 if you're holding this 6th string, 2nd fret note down with your index finger. If you can reach up to 5 with your pinky finger and then get your 3rd finger on 4 and then get that open, that's going to really give sustain and life to that melody. Notice that when I arrive on the next chord in measure 20, you can still faintly hear the ringing of the melody, and that's kind of what glues together this piece. At measure 21, we repeat the same idea from measure 17. But here in measure 22, we've got the same kind of thing happening with the melody, which is 5-4-0, and to the open. And I think it sounds really great if you can get that sustain going again. And the only real way to do that is, well, I guess if you did a 3-finger voicing of that chord, you could kind of use your pinky and maybe pull that off. But I find it's quite smooth if I use my first finger to bar half of the strings. And I use my pinky, second finger, and then open. So the more sustain you can give to that melody, the more life you're going to give to it. At the end of section C, you'll notice the ending of a repeat, which is your cue to go back to the beginning and play the whole thing again. There are a lot of ways to do this tune. It really lends itself to different types of repeats. The way it's written is just A, B, C again, followed by D. You could also do A, B, B, C, C, so you can kind of decide for yourself how you want to approach that. Now we've arrived at the ending, which this has to be, in terms of teaching, my favorite ending to any fingerstyle tune ever, because you don't even need your fretting hand really. You just pluck all those open strings. Of course, at the end, you've got to get to the 2nd fret to do your last chord. Don't feel like you need to be a robot and play that with a very strict timing. You can mess around with the timing a little bit, slow it down, repeat it. When you get to the last chord in measure 28, you can just play it as written. You might put a little bit of vibrato on the 2nd fret. You might do a hammer on to the 3rd fret and pull back off. If you know some other chords in this tuning or some cool trick with harmonics, you might throw that in there as well. Generally, I think for the last chord of a tune, why not go out with a bang and put a little of your own spin on it. So that's it for Drifting Clouds. So far, I don't think I've really met the guitar learner who was unable to get the basics of this tune down within a matter of a few weeks. So if you stick with it and you really focus on mastering those two chords particularly, and then you also maybe just spend a couple times just going through only thinking about your right hand plucking pattern with your, you could put your left hand on top of your head and just pluck out the strings in the correct order. I think if you do those exercises for a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks, you'll be really surprised at what you're able to do on this instrument with such a simple but really quite lovely tune. So that's it for Drifting Clouds. Thanks so much to Masaaki Kishibe for allowing me to teach this tune. Really, really appreciate it, and I hope you learned a lot.